Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the It's a Mind Game podcast. My name is Jade, and I'm so delighted to have the wonderful Jacqueline back to discuss part 3 of our ever-evolving values conversation. And I think we've gone through trying to sort of find what they are, how we can use them, how they could be a little bit toxic to our process. And we thought we might lighten the mood, which is how we sort of ended our last podcast with how enriching and how wonderful they can be when harnessed and used wisely. So with that in mind, welcome back, Jacqueline. I'm so excited to explore this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me back, Jade. It's always a delight to have these conversations with you and to honor the trilogy of those conversations about values, because we did, as you say, really unpack how it can be a lot more than meets the eye when it comes to the values conversation. It isn't as much of a quick solution or quick fix as it can seem, but also that once we understand everything that they can hold, implementing them really can create a lot more sense of self-empowerment and really help us to feel more excited and inspired about how we're creating our lives again. So I'm really looking forward to talking about that more today.
Yeah, and look, one thing I've learned since having these conversations with you, which I've thoroughly enjoyed myself, is that idea, I guess, on deeper thought, that sometimes our values and what we think they are kind of things predetermined by society. Like we really quickly jump to perhaps family, health, relationships, money. Like there's some really hot picks. And when you really take the time to actually think about things, explore, and even do an audit almost on your daily life, it can be really interesting to see that perhaps those values aren't even in your top 3, or perhaps the order isn't what you think it is. And even just thinking about it myself, it was really interesting to see how the order of things actually shifted a little bit when I looked more deeply into it. So hopefully some of our listeners are experiencing the same thing, where they're kind of going in and having a deeper thought about it. And perhaps this is where this conversation is coming at a perfect time, because let's say we've done some of the tools and suggestions we've discussed in our early episodes, and okay, we've got what we think is suitable to our life right now, knowing that our values could evolve and change. What is the best way to, I guess, start using them and harnessing them to be that North Star that we described in that first part of our values episode?
This is the really fun bit, because we get to be proactive and feel a sense of agency. So our values aren't just these abstract words that we might like hang on the wall of our home and hope manifest in some way. We get to really bring their flavor into our day-to-day. And I think being quite creative with them can be a way of sourcing energy around the creation of a life with those values being heralded more so. So for example, sometimes I like to have a theme value in a day that I'd choose one of my values, or even a value that might not be in my top 3, but something that's relevant at that time, a quality that I'm working with, and just decide to pay attention to how I can bring it into the day as much as possible. So there might be just little things like how I'm driving, how I'm greeting people, how I'm answering the phone. How would that shift, if at all, if I brought that value more to the forefront of my mind? So say it was something like respect or self-respect, that even in the way that that phone call might be managed or boundaries around that show up, it helps me stay more aware of that, and it keeps it simple enough to be tangible as well. Sometimes, and after the conversations we've had, it's philosophically really interesting and really important, so that we don't end up making the values in our life bigger that were maybe not ours to begin with. But then we can bring it back down to just some really easeful approaches that make it tangible in a day-to-day sense.
I like this idea of picking a theme for the day, because I guess it enhances that idea of harmony versus I must be so respectful every single day of every single week of every single month, which instantly gets so intense so quickly. And I guess one of the things I thought of as you were describing that process was, depending on what our stresses in life are, what our joys in life are, could actually determine what is the best theme for that day. Knowing that, like, if your theme is respect, like you referred to, that, you know, there's good opportunities within that day to actually use it, versus picking a different theme that you're trying to pursue and it doesn't seem to fit with that day, and then you feel like you failed it, you suck at life, you couldn't even do it for one day. And instantly you couldn't become so critical, when the core of it was like, maybe it just wasn't the best day to try and bring that in.
Exactly. Yeah. And I've used this at times when I'm really busy. I similarly used it when I had a newborn, and doing, like, it wasn't possible to do a lot of journaling or meditating or the other things that I might want to do for myself. But I thought, I'm going to just think about what I need to the best of my awareness each morning, and just focus on bringing that to my day, but also appreciating where it shows up more for me. I remember one day it was just space. I just felt like that was what I needed. And although there wasn't a lot I could do differently to create more space in my day with a newborn, I did notice differently what was already there. So the moments of quiet in the in-between. And I remember having a shower that day and thinking, oh, this is space. This is my space for today. Which, if I hadn't had that at the forefront of my mind, it would have just been a monotonous task that was done, and it didn't mean any more than the process of having a shower and moving on to the next task. So it brings that aliveness back into life. That is a really important part of feeling empowered and feeling like we are participating in life and not just living it or it living us. When we see like the aliveness and the interactivity we can have with all of life's meanings and what's on offer, then it starts to get a bit more fun.
It definitely reminds me of that idea of seizing the moment. And I particularly like the example you said of the shower, because, you know, some of our listeners are new mums, or some can't wait to be mums. And definitely that idea of a shower, of finally you've got a moment to just have your hands to yourself. But sometimes you can be so caught up in the bubble of finding your feet and just working out this new life that's been thrown at you. And don't get me wrong, it's an absolute blessing, but it's more confronting than anyone ever described to me. And you and I have had this chat, and we might open it up in another podcast. It really is a whole new world that needs new skills. And there is the potential to be in the shower and just be like, oh my goodness, and then as soon as I get out, I got to do this and I got to do that, and is the baby crying, when there's so many questions. But you could also use that time in the shower to be like, oh, it's nice to just listen to the sound of water, or nice to feel the rain. I'm looking outside my window and it's raining. Or feel the water on my skin and just sort of enjoy that. And either way, it's a few minutes in the shower. That part's not changing, but how we're actually using it to sort of almost self-soothe is so different.
Exactly. Where otherwise those moments would just be missed. They don't get treasured. And it's really strengths based in that sense too, because we might notice with something like, say we're giving ourselves a hard time about being a people pleaser and not having very good boundaries and being walked over. And so our word for the day, say it is boundaries, or it is putting ourselves first for the day. It might help us take the opportunity to do that more so, but it also might highlight where we actually already did have some things in place that were protective of ourselves, and putting in place the want for our best and reflective of our self-regard, that we wouldn't have noticed if we weren't looking through that lens as well.
Yeah, I wonder, let's look at setting the idea of boundaries and that being sort of the theme of the day. What, I guess, sort of things could we be looking out for to know if we're sort of making the most of that, versus kind of observing and not really optimizing it? It's like, I should have. What's some, I guess, boundaries that we might underrate because they're little boundaries that we might all have, but we don't look at them because everyone kind of does it, versus some boundaries where we quite clearly know we will want to set them, but the idea of judgment kicking in or letting somebody down kind of makes it that bit more difficult to actually act on.
That's great. It's great to pick up on that, because I think part of what becomes really important in this conversation is the somatic experience of our values. And that's something I've really learned to pay attention to, also to help discern the truthfulness or the value within the value that we were speaking to last episode, because we could have an idea like something like kindness might come up, and we think, all right, I want to be more kind in my day. And what ends up happening is that we perpetuate people pleasing. That wasn't actually kind to ourselves, pardon me, or to the other party. And when we come to marry that awareness more with what we're noticing in our body as well, we'll be more likely to pick up on where our values are getting crossed. So things to me that would cue the early, because it often is that kind of tap on the shoulder, early symptom of crossing our values or our boundaries, that is in our body. And then by the time it's become a really big thing, we're very cognitively aware of it. It might be a conversation. It might be a conversation that includes other people by that point. And that's also, as you say, where it gets a lot harder. It's a lot more impactful to make a change or set a boundary in that context because of the ramifications of it. So things like starting to notice where the tone of your voice changes and the pitch of your voice changes. Something I've observed for a lot of women is that when we start to move more into people pleasing, the pitch will get higher in our voice. And you might notice that even if you say you're not feeling great one day and you duck into the supermarket and you're really hoping not to bump into anyone, and then you see that person you know, and so you mask up straight away. It's that instinct of being, hi, how are you? It's so good to see you. And we go into that higher pitched register, and also probably a hardening in our body of sort of shoulders up, and even clench the fists a little bit, sort of clench the jaw, like I've got to get through this, grit your teeth and bear it. That mentality, that survival instinct really starts to pick up. We don't feel well equipped that day or well resourced, so we go straight into that reactivity. So we could start to notice something like that as also a clue that at the values that we're paying attention to at the moment might not be getting enough space to be enlivened, to be breathed into our life in those situations, because we've just gone into the performance, or we've gone into what we've been trained to provide.
That example you gave with the, hey, how are you? The other idea that popped into my head was when someone asks you to do something, like, yeah, of course, no worries, I don't mind. Because like, I think most of us can think of when we've done it personally, or the reaction of somebody else going like, yes. And I wonder with that, is there also, I guess, anything that you've observed where sort of repeating the answer multiple times is also a signal of, I guess, overdoing it? That could be a kind of a flag for us to also recognize, well, perhaps if I was to repeat that moment, and that could be something that we kind of move on to next, is you don't have to have perfect days when we're trying to work out these things. And that's probably a really good example of whether you're bumping into someone and you're having that heightened, like, hi, how are you? Let's put on the persona that we want everyone to see, or someone asking something, yeah, of course, can't wait to do it. And then on reflection going, okay, well, how could I have used the value of boundaries first? Or even really, it falls into self-respect too, by doing what honors what you need in that moment. And it's the hindsight perspective would be, okay, well, perhaps when someone asks me a question, I need to take a breath first and then answer, rather than that autopilot yes. Or even just the idea of when you're about to see somebody, kind of just reconsolidating that you don't have to put on a show in order to have that person like you, because that's probably something that falls into that I better put on a show and glorify life and be super happy and enthusiastic. Is we know we're such energetic beings, and if you're super hyper, for the most part, people match that. But it doesn't mean that you're only liked if you're being super hyper. For the most part, I love every conversation that we have, but we're quite neutral with our tones. We're not always like, oh my God, Jacqueline, I'm so happy to talk to you. And yet we're really, really passionate about what we talk about. And we have an ever evolving friendship as a result of these conversations and things outside of this. But just consolidating that idea that we don't have to be extra all the time in order for people to respect us, like being around us, enjoying our company. And I guess that idea of showing up as our authentic self rather than feeling that showy version is all that we need to, all that we can be in order to get the outcome we want.
There's so much value in what you've just spoken through, and I love that. Hopefully, we're role modeling that too, which is a really lovely link with what we've been speaking to, because it's true. I think about people I feel comfortable with, like you, and I don't feel like I need to go into that that performative kind of hyper receptivity. And when I reflect on that, it's the quality of trust definitely comes to mind. There's a sense of I'm seen, I'm safe, I trust the connection, I trust you, and so I can feel deeply, and you and I both do feel so passionately about what we speak about, and there might be excitable moments, but there isn't a feeling of having to like the script is already pre-written and the obligation to just speak it, which when we have that moment, especially when it's unexpected, I think it's often quite revealing, like that bumping into someone we don't expect to see, where it really exposes where we're at in that moment in our nervous system, that we just react straight into the expectation. Or it can be called fawning, that the fight, flight, freeze and fawning response. Pleasing is a form of a survival response because we don't feel safe enough to just show up more settled, more neutrally. I think it's so interesting that a conversation about enhancing values has come into discussing people pleasing as such a core component of that, because that is probably a huge interruptive factor for many women in living their values. And when you were saying take a deep breath before responding, even for really entrenched people pleasing, even starting over text and email is something I often recommend too, because we have the less interpersonal stimulus of the other person's facial expression and their voice, and the immediacy of I've got to say something within the next minute for it to be socially acceptable, and all I know to say is yes. So that ends up if that's what's being said. But if it's say over text, you could maybe play with wording it a few different ways before you send it, or you can use a few emojis to kind of soften it or feel better about how it's being presented. That could be a good entry point to then build into what happens interpersonally. But I think you've picked up on something that's really just gold in this conversation, that in best executing our values, we maybe concurrently need to be working on being settled in our lives, like a sense of regulation, a sense of calmness needs to be there, or we're at really high risk for just repeating the old.
And I wonder, with that thought in mind, a lot of women that are struggling with eating disorders or even anxiety, depression, things like that, there's that high sort of cortisol response that has a sort of heightened anyway. Do you sort of find that can be a bit of a theme, that they all kind of collaborate together, the idea of people pleasing already in a heightened response, and that idea of knowing that you want to make different choices that perhaps honor your values, but because you're in that elevated state, it kind of feels like you're pushing the rock uphill rather than being able to roll it down and kind of go with the flow. And I guess that suggestion that you said with starting off with text messages or emails first really helps kind of practice the idea to build in the circuitry, and therefore have the confidence to allow it to take place face to face, when perhaps during that time frame of practicing, maybe we've learned to kind of self-soothe and calm down and be a little bit more settled. And the reason I say self-soothe is because some of us almost become addicted to that. I'm always in a rush, I'm always in a hurry. And if you took the time to think about it, yes, you've got a big to-do list, but you don't have to feel at a 10 about it. But we kind of get hooked on that feeling of, unless I'm at a 10, I'm useless or I'm not doing anything. But it's not actually relative to what we're trying to achieve in life. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that idea of trying to, I guess, calm down in life overall so that we can actually use our values in a greater capacity than just being heightened and trying to calm down and trying to change direction all at the same time?
It's such a great insight because it completely is a package. So the people pleasing, perfectionism, cortisol, high achieving, that I was also thinking how perfectionism can be dangerous with values, because then we might pick up on a value that, first of all, we might discern from a perfectionistic lens. So we think, well, I should have this value because that's what is the right value to have. But then when we implement it, we also expect so much of ourselves in that regard, or just beat ourselves up because of how it doesn't end up looking, rather than what I was speaking to earlier of the opportunity of even noticing what's already there around it, which if you've thought of it as a value that's highly important to you, chances are that you are implementing it a lot already and you just want to do more so. It's unlikely that it's totally alien to your life if it's something that you know is really important to you. And maybe if it is, that could almost be a symptom that it could be more of a socially indoctrinated value, because likely otherwise you would be living with it in some way to some capacity. So that if women are, like, if you recognize yourself in that state, and it's not as easy as just turning off a switch. I understand that. So how do you work with being in a heightened state and wanting to do values work, but knowing that things like perfectionism and people pleasing are really there for you? And I think it's like less exciting, but more sustainable to just work with that idea of looking at the soft edges of introducing that quality, and where it could just be a little bit extra of an influence in your life in the words that you use, swapping out specific words that you might choose to say that say the quality was being more positive. You might just opt for particular changes in language where you have the awareness to that. Also could be easier in writing to start with than in your day-to-day verbal communication. But it can be just really gentle, and there absolutely is a change just when we've changed our minds about something. There already is change before any behavior comes through. So if you're just thinking about it and you're thinking, gosh, I'd love to have being spontaneous as a more of a quality or a value in my life, or even a day's theme could be like spontaneous day. And that could be just such a gentle, different choice of something that you do, or a subtle change that you make in your day. It doesn't mean that you have to fly to Rome by midnight. It could be something so gentle. And because of that, most change that happens that is true and genuine lifelong change happens gently, and it builds. Even the way the eating disorder develops that is usually true. Not always, but more often when you look at the roots of how this came into someone's life, it's a story of, I guess in hindsight, I had XYZ qualities for a while, and then I went through a stressful time, and then there was that breakup, or there was that illness, or there was something else that really brought it to the forefront. And then I just kept it to myself for a while, and then it blew up. And it's like years and years of these stepping stones into finding themselves into a place that's clinically relevant, but it didn't happen overnight, and recovery won't either, and these changes won't either. It's the parallel experience of easing it out of life and enhancing quality of life and value in life that crowds out the need for disordered behaviors and thoughts.
It's such a common conversation I have with some of the ladies that I work with, that idea of, your eating disorder did creep in over time. Like, it was very sneaky and subtle and very well intentioned. Again, no one just wakes up and goes, oh, I'm going to have an eating disorder today. The end. Like, it never presents itself that way. It creeps and it creeps and it creeps until all of a sudden it's just there and it's dominating. But then you've got the awareness and you get the support and the tools, and it will creep out, or you will gradually push it away. But I think that it also leads to that idea that we can't expect to just move a mountain in a day. As you said, like it took time. These roots have been slowly grown, and we will slowly shrink the roots. But I love just bringing that up as often as possible, because it's such an enduring process. Like it takes time and conscious effort, but the reality is we can always get to where we want to be with, I think it's more helpful to know that it's going to take time versus this idea of an 8-week course or a 12-week it's not that simple. And you probably wouldn't want it to be, because I don't think you like to really do the work. It's like an onion, you just keep peeling off all these different layers. And often if you reflect back on the things that you've learned in the time that you've spent trying to get out of your eating disorder, you start to learn so much more about yourself. Like, I had no idea I thought this way, or I was acting this way. And when you move into a safer space with it, it becomes quite a beautiful observation to be like, I can so see how this formed. And I can also see how I'm going to get myself out. And that's so empowering once you get there. Something you touched on, though, with the idea of, I think it was implementing the changes. You said so many things. I'm trying to revert back to which was the key point, because it was just wonderful. But I guess that idea of when you're trying to add values in, that if you're really wanting to enhance them, it's not about having the perfect value themed day, like that perfectionism piece. I think that's what I was going to go to, but more, you might select a theme for the day, optimize what you can, where you can, and then I guess reflect back at night and go, oh, well, this worked well. Maybe I could have used this better. And there's not this, I failed or I passed, but just more of an awareness around things that worked, things that could go better. But I guess not attaching a judgment or a grading to it, but instead just a ever-going sort of, I just think like a beautiful tornado, in the way that it's spinning, but it's growing at the top.
Beautiful. Yeah. And that it is, I like phrases like leaning in and enhancing, and even thinking maybe about a ratio of reflecting on that quality, that value in your day. If it was something like, say, we chose kindness at the beginning of the day, and we ended up arguing with our partner before 8 a.m. and having road rage on the way to work and conflict with our colleagues,
Life.
and having life. And by lunchtime, we're thinking, not working out as the way I predicted. But maybe on that day, in the circumstances that came up in your life, there would, I'm sure, still be ways that you chose kindness over the other options, in what you didn't say in that argument with your partner, in what you didn't do when you felt road rage. That very much so, it may not look like the perfect image of what comes to mind when we think of kindness, of some angelic acts of self-sacrificing and generosity, but within the range we had, within the capacity we had, the amount of sleep that we got, the personal space and time that we had, we leaned in towards what we could, and we'll keep trying to do that. And maybe that afternoon or the next day, there's a few less objective challenges, and we can be more aware of it being lit up within us. But that when we are mindful of these ideas, they will stay close to us and they will continue to be available. Once we shut down and we give up because it feels too hard and it's not working anyway, and we go into cognitively very much a survival space of just getting through, that's when things get more dangerous from a mental health perspective, because something like an eating disorder is going to seem a lot more attractive, whether it's brewing or whether it's already active and you're trying to move away from it. It feels like there's less to lose going into other options of other compensatory behaviors and things that can numb us and make us feel better in the short term. There's less of a cost to that if we're not living in a values-based way, and we're not building, to me, life really isn't about objective ideas of success or even being happy, because I I don't know that we have as much control over that as we might want to think that we do. Where we do have influence is in the life artistry of how we live, and the use of the authorship in the time that we have on this earth to enhance and bring forth the things that we thought would best serve us and maybe even best serve humanity. So it becomes really important. Like, grading is a great word that you use, to not sort of give ourselves a credit average for the day, or like that was a pass or that was a fail, or I totally nailed that, I'm so proud of that, but then have to compare ourselves to that standard the next day. Much more so just I like the phrase like breathing into the quality as well. To me, that really captures how we make it alive with our own breath, with our own livingness, our energy, our attention, when we bring it into our world. And that's part of what I think we're here to do. Like, that's part of the best of what it is to be human, is the influence that we get in where we can make a difference in how we experience life, and how by proxy others are going to experience it around us.
Yeah, I love the idea of, like, you know, you're narrating your own story, or you're creating the chapters that are yet to come. So again, it's not like that perfect outcome, but instead it's like, what do you want to make of what is occurring at this point in time? Because we can always draw from the wisdom of our past. We can always draw from the excitement of what we hope to happen in the future, what we desire. But I guess the beauty in it is there's so many variables that there is so much that is open to change. And that's actually what makes life so beautiful, is that, okay, you could have the day from hell, but it also means that one of the best days of your life could be around the corner. And you sort of can't have one without the other. So rather than always aspiring to this perfect day of joy and happiness and gratitude that kind of gets pushed in our face a lot, instead going, oh, well, perhaps this day that hasn't been great and I'm feeling sad about it, or overwhelmed or horrible, is that there's something for me to take away from it and move through, or move with, or have a better grounding on what's going to occur in the future. Like, sometimes having those down days also allows us to extract how we could have a better day should something present itself again. And then that better day occurs and it's like, oh, wow, there's the perspective. It's like, that was so much better than the first time it presented itself. And, you know, I was so sad or overwhelmed. And I guess that turns into that ever-evolving story of, it's living the day that's about to be had and deciding what's next and how you're going to use it, versus feeling like the day controls what's going to happen for you.
So beautifully said. And that's such a great point about contrast. And it really speaks to the conversations we've had about harmony, that we can't know those qualities without the contrast, and they don't have that flavor if they're not part of a smorgasbord of options that are also known to us. And the only way we're able to decide what our values are is because we know what they are not, and we only know what they are not by experiencing those things in our life, from our own behavior through other people. That's really important. Yeah.
Which I guess, when you think about enhancing values, could be another thing ourselves or our listeners experience, which is thinking, no, this is absolutely one of my values, I know it has to be true, and then applying that theme for a day, a couple of days, multiple days, and perhaps it doesn't sit as high on the tier as what you thought it would. And again, that doesn't mean you failed the activity of working out your values. It just meant you learnt what's true to you, and that thing's still important, but there's actually other things that are more important, and honoring those brings you joy. So just knowing that, even if you've listened to the other episodes and you're reading things and doing the journaling and the practices, and you've had that, aha, this is me, knowing that it could still change once you start to implement it. And it could change again and again and again, because your work life is going to change, your relationships are going to change, things are ever evolving. And I guess, as we discussed, there could be some things that are just core values there that are incredibly consistent, you know, that idea of kindness or family or like connection, but there's others that kind of trickle back and forth, which it's so interesting how upon conversation that always leads us back to that harmony piece where, nothing's perfectly balanced all the time. Instead, it's just this beautiful, almost like an ocean wave, I guess. There's a big swing and then it retreats back, and a big swing and then it retreats back. And I guess we look at how much a lot of us love watching waves crash. It's like there's something bittersweet about watching the rise and the crash. And often that can be symbolic of our lives. Like we have triumphs and we have crashes, and it doesn't mean we're failing or succeeding. It just is.
Out of chaos comes order, always. And that is also very true. Sometimes it has to feel like your values are crumbling down, or you don't know what they are when they're reinventing themselves, and that we finesse them. I think the general overarching themes of values tend to be consistent, but we finesse our understanding and are able to make them ever more meaningful in our world, which is when studies are done on the biggest factors of well-being for people and what also contributes to longer life expectancy. The experience of feeling like you were validated in your existence and you had some sort of impact, you contributed in some way, is a really important thing for human beings. And we find it in values. We find, I was able to make this workplace a kinder environment for me and my colleagues, or I was able to leave this information behind that will help people, that will protect other people in some way that's important to me. These are things that literally add years to our life because they mean so much and they're so good for our mental health. It's incredibly important.
Yeah, and I hope that our listeners today get some beautiful takeaways in regards to working on the values. And again, I think that theme day is such a perfect piece to add in, because it's like it's variable depending on what the day you've got. You can be creative and just have a play around with different themes. And if you want to get really creative, you can just Google lists of values and be like, oh, perhaps it's not one of my top 5, but that sounds really interesting. I wonder, because even that idea of language and are we accurately describing what we want to falls into the values we're choosing. So you might pick really broad things because they're those key values we hear all the time, but then you sort of look at some more intrinsic lists and go, oh, that's really appealing to me, and it's actually a lot more specific and unique, and perhaps you would have thought of that earlier but you didn't know the reference or the word or the emotions that are attached to it. So just that ever-evolving door of research is great, awareness is great, practicing is great, and sometimes even discussing how your theme days turned out with your friend, with your psychologist, your coach, your tribe could help you better understand how these things influence your life, both positively and negatively, and open up even more doors to what could be, because discussion's so powerful, isn't it? I mean, even if you think about our chats, we just unpack these new things and more things pop up, and it's like a flower blooming. It's so powerful, and all of us can have that.
There's this beautiful saying in psychotherapy from one of the founders of psychotherapy that I learn what I think as I hear myself speak, which I love. It's very much what you're saying.
Yes, that's so perfect. Absolutely perfect. Now, before we finish things up, I'm very excited to be sharing some news about you. You've started a brand new venture. Do you want to share with us what's happening and how we can get in on it?
I have begun my very own podcast with a dear friend and former colleague called the Sisterhood Downloads, which we are creating a space to talk about experiences in motherhood, experiences really of modern life for women, entrepreneurship, experiences in business, career, and ultimately supporting women to thrive. And you can find us at the Sisterhood Downloads on Apple Music and most platforms where podcasts are available, or follow along at the Sisterhood Downloads podcast on Instagram.
Yes, no, I've listened to the first 2 episodes. I'm yet to listen to the third. It's on my to-do list for this weekend, and I've loved them, not gonna lie. But to our listeners, I hope you jump on board. And if you have any feedback or thoughts, please share it with us. We would love to hear it. But as always, Jacqueline, thank you so much for coming on and joining us today. I'm going to leave all of your details in the show notes. And in case some of you are joining in on this episode that you haven't heard before, Jacqueline is an incredibly educated, experienced psychotherapist who specializes in ED recovery and just is so incredible to have in your tribe. So please do consider that. But for now, Jacqueline, thank you so, so much for joining us again. And I can't wait till the next conversation.
Me too, Jade, a pleasure.
Thanks so much for joining us on today's episode. I hope you loved it. If you feel like sharing it, one of the best ways is to take a screenshot of the podcast and share it to your stories. And if you'd like to tag me, I'd love to give you a shout out and chat to you about how you're enjoying the podcast. And if you have any ideas on what you would love brought to you next time. But for now, please check out the show notes for any links and tools. And I cannot wait to speak to you in the next one.